UFC 300, the century card, the biggest card of the last decade. Today, we're going to be comparing UFC 300 to the previous century card, UFC 200, to see how it stacks up in terms of card strength. Stick around to hear my thoughts. I'm Wyatt, and this is Fight Society. All right, guys, so today we are going to take a look at UFC 300 and UFC 200 to compare the two century cards of the last 10 years and see how strong these cards are when compared to each other. First off, we'll start with the main event. We have, for UFC 300, Alex Pereira versus Jamal Hill. This is a very strong main event. Alex Pereira has become a star in the UFC. And when you compare it to the actual main event of UFC 200, which was Amanda Nunes versus Miesha Tate, obviously you're going to take the UFC 300 main event as a better main event for such a big card, Pereira versus Hill. But when you consider that the UFC 200 main event was supposed to be Jon Jones versus Daniel Cormier, and Jon Jones testing positive and getting pulled from the card, when you consider that, UFC 200 had a much better main event. And I think that the UFC genuinely did want to have Jon Jones as the UFC 300 main event, but he got injured in November and he's not going to be ready to fight until later this year. But their plans were, for sure, in my opinion, to have Jon Jones beat Stipe at Madison Square Garden in November and then make a heavyweight title defense at UFC 300 as the main event. But his pec injury ended up throwing a wrench into all of those plans. Now, when you look at the co-main event of 300, you have Zhang Weili versus Yan Xiaonan, and 200 is Brock Lesnar versus Mark Hunt. The bigger fight is obviously Brock Lesnar, but considering that this is a title fight, you could say that this is a better card from a rankings and legitimacy standpoint. But UFC 200, I'm also going to say that the co-main event of Brock Lesnar is a bigger fight and a more fun and fan-friendly fight than Zhang Weili versus Yan Xiaonan. So the real card for 200, which ended up being Amanda Nunes, it's split right now 1-1. But if it would have stayed with Jon Jones versus DC as the main event, and then Nunes Miesha Tate as the co-main event, and then Brock Lesnar below that, then I would definitely put 200 over 300. Now, the feature bout for UFC 200 was Daniel Cormier fighting Anderson Silva at 205 on short notice due to Jon Jones not being able to fight on the card. Big fight, two Hall of Famers, arguably the GOAT in Anderson Silva, best middleweight champion ever, against Hall of Famer, former two-division champion DC. But you also have this BMF fight here of Justin Gaethje versus Max Holloway. And given the style matchup, I would actually say that I prefer Justin Gaethje versus Max Holloway. Maybe you guys will say that I'm being a little recency biased towards that fight, but I do think that I'm actually more excited to see Justin Gaethje versus Max Holloway moving up in weight with a full camp versus, I'd much rather see that over Daniel Cormier fighting a middleweight, albeit the best middleweight of all time, fighting a middleweight on like a week's notice because the real main event with Jon Jones fell through. So I'm going to give the feature bout to UFC 300. When I look at the fourth fight on the card, you have interim featherweight fight, Jose Aldo versus Frankie Edgar. At the time, this was a big fight. Two former champs. I get it, okay? I get it. This is when Conor McGregor had vacated the 145-pound strap. Or I'm sorry, no, he was going to move up to he was awaiting the Nate Diaz fight, and then he was going to move up to 55 after that. So Aldo ended up winning this and being promoted to undisputed, I believe, if my memory is correct. But Charles Oliveira, for me, is one of my favorite fighters. I understand that from a legacy standpoint, Aldo versus Edgar is definitely the better fight and the bigger fight at the time. I know that Aldo versus Edgar is for sure a better fight on paper. And so I'm going to give UFC 200 the edge on this, but from a personal standpoint, I would much rather watch Charles Oliveira try to get another title shot. And against Arman Tsarukyan, this is maybe the biggest lightweight #1 contenders fight of all time. And then when you look at the main card opener, Cain Velasquez versus Travis Browne, so former heavyweight champ against Travis Browne, and then you have Bo Nickel, Cody Brundage. I don't even really need to explain this one. I'm going to give this one to UFC 200 because Cain Velasquez is a former champ. Bo Nickel, 5-0, fighting a mid opponent with ridiculously uncompetitive odds, with no ranked wins. Definitely got to give that to UFC 200. So far I have the edge to 200, but then we have to take a look at the prelims. The feature prelim of UFC 200, Kat Zingano and Juliana Pena versus Yuri Prohaska and Alexander Rakic, top 5 matchup. Maybe the winner of this fight will fight Alex Pereira next if it doesn't go to Magomed Ankalaev, but 300 definitely gets the edge there. You move down one, Gastelum versus Johnny Hendricks. You have Calvin Kattar, Aljamain Sterling. Definitely going with 300 on that. Move down, TJ Dillashaw versus Rafael Assunção. Definitely going to give that the edge over Holly Holm, Kayla Harrison. Down from there, Sadiq Youssef versus Diego Lopes. And then Sage Northcutt versus Enrique Marin. This is where Bo Nickel should have been placed on the card, like opening the prelims, because Sage Northcutt was the big star or big prospect they were trying to build at the time. This is where Bo Nickel should be on the card, as opposed to being all the way up here. Bo Nickel should be about 5 fights sooner opening the prelims. And then on the early prelims, you have Diego Sanchez versus Joe Lauzon, and then Jalen Turner, Renato Moicano. Definitely going to give the edge to 300 here. And then below that, Mousasi versus Thiago Santos. Way better fight than Andrade versus Rodriguez. Going to give the edge to 200. And then you have Jim Miller versus Takanori Gomi. And then on 300, you have Jim Miller versus Bobby Green. Potentially ranked matchup. The legacy of Jim Miller fighting on 100, 200, and 300. Going to give the edge to 300 on this. And then you have one extra fight on 200, or I'm sorry, on 300, Davison Figueiredo against Cody Garbrandt. Also, there is no fight to compare this to on 200, so I have to give the edge to 300 on this. When I look at the cards as a whole, main card, 100% I give to UFC 200. Main event doesn't stack up the same, but if John Jones versus DC would have remained the main event, 200 absolutely smokes 300 in terms of main card, or it's close, but 200 is still better than 300. And then from a prelim standpoint, I definitely think I give it to 300. So they did make the card much deeper for UFC 300, but they could have made the main card way better. They should have bumped Bo Nickel down, added a title fight, maybe added Sean Strickland to 300. He's a big star. Prelims, 300's better. It's a deeper card than 200. Main card, got to give it to UFC 200. Let me know what you guys think. Do you prefer UFC 300 or UFC 200? What was a better card? Give me your thoughts down below. If you like this video and you want more content just like this, click that subscribe button down below. If you want more content from me, go check out my weekly comedy podcast, the Hissyfit podcast, and go check out my personal channel, Wyatt's World. Go watch this suggested video, and I'll see you next time.